Συναδέλφοι και συνάδελφοι, καλησπέρα.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon. Sunday, the 14th of April, and we are here once again in the we are at a very difficult period. The Ministry of Education ignoring... Δεν ακούω, πες του.
Στο κομμάτι της ατομικής αξιολόγησης, την επιβολή και τις ποινές ως απειλή σε πρώτη φάση, αλλά με πρόθεση από ό,τι φαίνεται να τις υλοποιήσει στη συνέχεια, ως μια μέθοδο να εφαρμόσει την πολιτική του, αντί να δει ότι η αντίδραση του εκπαιδευτικού κόσμου είναι αυτή που πρέπει να το οδηγήσει στο τραπέζι του διαλόγου. Ο κλάδος συνεχίζει τον αγώνα του. Συνεχίζουμε τον αγώνα μας και στο κομμάτι της εσωτερικής και εξωτερικής αξιολόγησης με τα ενιαία κείμενα, που ξέρουμε ότι και αυτά προσπαθεί να τα ακυρώσει το Υπουργείο Παιδείας με πάρα πολλούς τρόπους, αλλά όπως έχει ομολογήσει σε συναντήσεις και σε συνάντηση ακόμη με την Ομοσπονδία δεν έχει καταφέρει να το κάνει. Εμείς συνεχίζουμε έναν αγώνα ο οποίος είναι πραγματικά για την υπεράσπιση του δημόσιου σχολείου ενάντια στις προθέσεις κατηγοριοποίησής του. Πέμπτη εκδήλωση λοιπόν σήμερα και έχουμε την τιμή να έχουμε κοντά μας τον καθηγητή του Πανεπιστημίου του Plymouth, κύριο Garry Hornby. Το θέμα της συζήτησής μας στη σημερινή είναι επίκαιρα ζητήματα και αντιπαραθέσεις για την ειδική και συμπεριληπτική εκπαίδευση, τεκμηριωμένες ερευνητικές διδακτικές πρακτικές. Ιδιαίτερα επίκαιρο, αφού το Υπουργείο Παιδείας ήδη έχει καλέσει τη Δασκαλική Ομοσπονδία να συζητήσει για την ειδική αγωγή, παρουσιάζοντας του προτάσεις που μέχρι τώρα τις έχει ως επτασφράγιστο μυστικό και δεν έχει δώσει τη δυνατότητα να έχουμε ως τώρα μια άποψη και να δούμε αν θα υπάρξει ο χρόνος ώστε να υπάρχει διάλογος σε αυτά που θα μας παρουσιάσει όταν θα συναντηθεί με το Διοικητικό Συμβούλιο της Δασκαλικής Ομοσπονδίας. Τη σημερινή συνάντηση συντονίζει ο Δημήτρης Αναστασίου, καθηγητής ειδικής αγωγής στο Southern Illinois University. Δεν χρειάζονται ιδιαίτερες συστάσεις με την έννοια ότι είναι πλέον ένας συνεργάτης της Δασκαλικής Ομοσπονδίας σε όλο αυτό τον κύκλο των εκδηλώσεων και τον ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για την συνεισφορά του σε όλη αυτή την προσπάθεια της Δασκαλικής Ομοσπονδίας. Ξεκινάμε αμέσως. Ευχαριστούμε τον κύριο Χόρμπι που είναι μαζί μας και του δίνουμε το λόγο.
Γεια σας. Να είμαστε και πάλι εδώ. Καλημέρα από εδώ, καλησπέρα σε εσάς, έχουμε 8 ώρες διαφορά.
We are back here. We have 8 hours difference. I would like to say that I would like to thank the Greek Primary Teachers Federation to be the coordinator of this discussion and say that I honor the struggles of the teachers and it's a pleasure to contribute in any way.
I would like to thank in the Greek Primary Teachers Federation once again, this time in English, for the invitation to be the moderator of today's discussion. During the presentation of Professor Garry Hornby, you can submit your written questions in Google Docs. It is an Excel form. After Professor Hornby's presentation, the questions in Greek will be translated by me and delivered to the speaker. Dr. Garry Hornby is an emeritus professor at the University of Plymouth, United Kingdom. He was born in England and emigrated to Auckland, New Zealand in 1971. In his initial career, he worked as a mainstream and special class teacher for 7 years. He then worked as an education psychologist for the Ministry of Education for 7 years. In 1986, he returned to England, where he conducted research and a lecture at the University of Manchester and the University of Hull for 14 years. During this period, he also served as a consultant on special needs education for the government of Barbados and a lecturer at the University of the West Indies from 1997 to 1999. He moved back to New Zealand to become professor of education at the University of Canterbury in 2002, where he worked for 12 years. In 2016 and 2017, he worked as professor of education and director of research at the University of Plymouth in the United Kingdom, becoming an emeritus professor in 2018. His academic contributions have been in several areas: education psychology, inclusive and special education, counseling, children's mental health, teacher education, and parental involvement in education. He has authored over 200 journal articles and book chapters, as well as 13 books on education-related topics. His published books include Mental Health Handbook for Schools, Counseling Pupils in Schools, Meeting Special Needs in Mainstream Schools, Improving Parental Involvement in Childhood Education, which is one of the main aspects of his work. And of course, Garry Hornby is famous for the book and a relevant article, Inclusive Special Education, in which make a combination of inclusion ideals with the special education strategies and programs. At this point, I would like to give a warm welcome to the Professor Garry Hornby. Garry, you have the floor.
Great, thanks very much, Dimitris. It's a great honor and pleasure to be able to speak with Greek teachers about the current goings on and challenges we have in special education worldwide. I need to realize I need to do something to, I need to get this slides. This is the difficulty is with the technical aspects of all this, but there we are. Looks like it. Anyway, yeah, so I see myself as somebody who's been a special education teacher, educational psychologist, lecturer, professor, and really supportive of helping as teachers and parents to educate kids with a range of special needs to become as independent and to achieve as much as possible in life. And this is an international endeavor that we're all involved in, and the challenges that I've seen that you are having in Greece are very similar to what the challenges we have in England, in Barbados, where I am, in New Zealand, in the USA, and a group of us academics, including Dimitris and Jim Kaufman, and you've heard about Jim, are really trying our best to keep special education improving and being seen as a vital part of the education system, which we believe it definitely is. And therefore, we've taken a perspective that perhaps isn't the most popular one, but we believe that most teachers and most parents are with us. And somehow it's some of the policymakers that have different views. So I hope to present to you something today a little bit, give you a different view and perhaps give you a more hopeful view of the future. And start here, thinking back to all the very happy memories I have of my various trips to Greece. This was a holiday trip. I've been to Greece for conferences as well, Athens, and I've visited Santorini and Crete, and that this was, you probably can see, is in Lindos, where you have to climb up the mountain to visit the castle at the top of Lindos. And this is my wife on a donkey. She was 5 months pregnant with our elder son, followed by her mother there and her father visiting Lindos. So bringing back some lovely memories. And of course, this is now more current. This is now our two sons. The one on the right was the one that was inside her tummy when we went to Lindos. They're now 31 and 28, and they now are both taller than their father, who I still maintain I'm 6 foot tall, but they're definitely bigger than me now. So I retired to Barbados with my wife, and the boys now live in London and in New York. So anyway, but lots of positive thoughts about Greece. So I feel at one with you. Okay, so inclusive special education, Dimitris mentioned, is something I came up with in 2014. I sort of partly stole the title from Finland. They'd used it to describe part of their education system. And I thought, well, this is really the way forward. That the goals of, anyway, I'll try and stick to the text. Rather than having both either inclusion or inclusive education or special education, my view is that we need both. We need inclusive education and special education because they're both necessary to provide optimal outcomes for students with special needs and disabilities. So it's not either or, we need both. So education systems should implement policies that combine the philosophy and values of inclusive education with the strategies and programs from special education so that they both can achieve equitable and excellent learning for all children with special needs. Inclusive education involves a recognition that special educational needs can be provided for appropriately within education systems that combine effective mainstream schools with high quality special education provision. And I've given there the 2014 is the date of the book, and then 2015 is the article that was in the British Journal of Special Education on inclusive special education. Inclusive special education considers that although most children can be educated in mainstream classrooms, a relatively small number benefit from being taught in special classes within mainstream schools or being educated in special schools. Mainstream schools need to work closely with special schools to enhance their provision of support for milder degrees of special needs, and special schools need to provide for education with children with more severe disability. So inclusive special education involves ongoing collaboration between teachers in mainstream and special schools and classes in order to ensure equitable and appropriate provision and optimum outcomes for all learners. And this is not just theory. I observed this when I spoke at a conference in Sydney a few years ago now. It was in Melbourne, not in Sydney, it was in Melbourne, Australia. And in Melbourne, Australia, the state of Victoria, they have a policy which is very similar to inclusive special education. It requires the same thing of special schools collaborating with mainstream schools and the teachers helping one another. And that's part of their policy, part of their procedures, or it was, and this is about 7 or 8 years ago now. Whereas in other parts of Australia, like Sydney and Queensland, in the different states, they've taken a more inclusive education approach. So there's choices which are being made. And that I intend to go into that a little bit with you. So inclusive special education requires a commitment to providing excellent education for all children with disabilities in the most appropriate setting for each individual child throughout all stages of education. So its focus is on the effective inclusion of children with special needs in mainstream schools as far as appropriate, along with the availability of a range of placement options from mainstream classes to special schools and special classes to special schools. So when inclusive special education is implemented, mainstream schools are organized effectively providing effectively for a wide range of children with special needs by using programs and strategies that are evidence-based and have been seen as the best practice for supporting the education of all learners. And in 2022, myself and Debbie Greaves, who is a special needs teacher in Atlanta, Georgia, in the USA, we wrote a book which focused on evidence-based practice for all children, but it's particularly relevant for children with special needs. I'll talk about that in a minute. Right, so let's compare this to full inclusion then. So you probably heard the idea of full inclusion is pushed by, I'll go into this, United Nations agencies, has been able to cater for all children with special needs. However, I consider that 3 myths about inclusion have been spread over the past 30 years and have been very influential and contributed to the current controversy about special education for children with special needs. The first myth is that full inclusion was recommended by the Salamanca Conference and the Salamanca Statement and Framework, whereas if you look at it carefully, it was not recommended. Full inclusion was not recommended. I'll explain this in a minute. The second myth is that full inclusion has been shown to be a feasible approach for meeting special needs in education systems. Excuse me. In Italy, I'll give you the examples of Italy and New Brunswick. Sometimes Portugal mentioned too, but Italy and New Brunswick I mentioned of examples where full inclusion has been successful. Unfortunately, it hasn't. The third myth is that there's convincing research evidence that inclusive education is more effective than special education in achieving successful outcomes for young people with special needs. Careful analysis of the research shows that there's not convincing evidence. And I'm going to give a little bit more information now about those 3 myths. And these are discussed at length in my latest book with Philippa Gordon-Gould, who's an English special educator. She works as a special needs support person in mainstream schools and has done for many years. And we combined to produce a book called Inclusive Education at the Crossroads, Exploring Special Needs Provision in Global Context, where we look at meeting special needs in many countries across the world. So that's the latest book if you want to follow up on these myths and similar things. So the 3 myths are briefly addressed on the following slides. So, okay, so full inclusion was recommended by the Salamanca Statement. That's a myth. The purpose of the conference and the treaty at Salamanca was to address the fact that 350 million children in the world were not accessing any forms of education. So the thing was to include those children in education systems, which of course we fully support. So government saw this as an opportunity to actually look good, look ethical by supporting this inclusion. But unfortunately, this could be seen as being expedient, that inclusion appeared to be a cheaper way of maintaining special education infrastructure, for example, special schools. So the Salamanca Treaty has been used to promote a fully inclusive education system by UNESCO and other UN agencies for all countries that signed up to ratify the treaties we'll talk about in a minute. Whereas Salamanca actually talked about a majority of children with special needs being included in mainstream schools, a majority, not all. Salamanca did not propose all children being included in mainstream classrooms, which is now being promoted by United Nations agencies. And the United Nations itself, through 2 reports, UN Global Education Monitoring Report and the UNESCO Review, reported that most countries worldwide still have a 2-track education systems, general and special education. So the majority of countries acknowledge that they need mainstream school with many children with special needs in there, but they also need separate special needs provision, that maybe special classes or resource rooms and special schools. So that's the reality. The United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities was signed by most countries, including Barbados, where I am now, Finland, Ireland, probably Greece. Greece almost certainly signed it as well, and then ratified it a bit later. And it's a binding international human rights treaty that specifically addresses disability, and it aims to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities. But in 2016, an addendum, General Comment number 4, came out, an addendum to this legislation, to Article 24. And that claimed that the human rights of children with learning disabilities would be better met if they were included in mainstream classes. And it claimed that this would be provide a superior education than special education, so that special schools were not even mentioned in that General Comment number 4, if you look at it. But no evidence was provided for the claim in there that mainstream classes could provide a more effective education than special education for all children with special needs. So that was put in there without any evidence to support it. In practice, the experience of nations around the world have been it's very difficult or impossible to achieve this full inclusion. So despite this, full inclusion without any special education remains a policy that's being imposed on countries by the United Nations Commission on the Rights of People with Disabilities. It's very unfortunate. The second myth is that full inclusion is a feasible approach to education. And in many documents, full inclusion policy in New Brunswick, Canada schools is promoted as a model for inclusive education. And they do involve all children with special needs in mainstream classrooms in New Brunswick, apparently. Unfortunately, the effectiveness of this model has not been objectively evaluated. And after 30 years, there's actually no articles presenting data to evaluate the effectiveness of this model. But what there is, if you look on Google, if you Google this, you'll find a torrent of newspaper articles from teachers, parents, and education officials that are very critical of their own full inclusion of policy in New Brunswick. And so they recognize it's really letting down the children and letting down the teachers. So very negative from people within New Brunswick, but very positive from the United Nations as a way forward for everybody else on the planet. I don't think so. So why has this happened in New Brunswick? Well, it's a very sparse population spread over a large area. So very difficult to set up special education classes in schools. So easy just to throw everybody into mainstream schools and call them being included. But it doesn't appear feasible to providing appropriate education for all children with special needs. Whereas other Canadian provinces have not adopted the New Brunswick full inclusion model, and they still have special schools and special classes. And when you look at data on academic achievement across Canada, you'll find there are higher levels of academic achievement in the other Canadian provinces rather than New Brunswick. Now, this could be for several reasons, but it could also be the fact that this full inclusion policy is really not helping not only the children with special needs, but it's not helping the education system generally, but still being promoted by the United Nations. So to me, it's an example of inclusion philosophy taken to its illogical conclusion, to the detriment of all children involved, those with and those without special needs. And for more information, I refer you to this article by Jim Kaufman and myself, Special Education Zombies and Their Consequences. And we made this open access article, so everybody can access it. Just put the title into Google, and it's open access, John. It goes through the myths that I've talked about above and provides more evidence for it. This is the link for that article. So the third myth is that there's convincing research evidence that inclusive education is more effective than special education. And such claims usually cite studies and reviews of studies with serious research, with serious errors, serious flaws in research methodology, and of course with an obvious bias towards full inclusion. But as you know, it's unethical to conduct randomized control trials of inclusive education versus special education. Clearly, you can't select people and put them into groups, you know, because that would jeopardize the education of some of them. So we don't have randomized control trials. So we don't have convincing evidence one way or the other. So several reviews of literature over the past 30 years have concluded there's no consistent evidence for the advantage of either special education or inclusive education, yet it's still promoted by United Nations and various governments as being the future. Whereas over the past 20 years, several studies have found that special education interventions can be effective in improving the outcomes of people with special needs. For example, I did a paper in 2021 in Education Sciences, which again is open access, where I gave some examples where special education interventions appeared to result in better outcomes for children with special needs than when they were included in mainstream schools. So you might want to have a look at that one. It's just one article, and I dare say it's not the perfect article, but it provides some evidence. Now, looking globally then at policies affecting children with special needs, and in particular, a couple of countries I've been involved in. I spent 27 years of my life working in New Zealand as a teacher, educational psychologist, and professor, and also in Barbados, where we live now, where I as Dimitris said, I was here for 2 years as a special needs consultant. So, and you know, the very different education systems. And Finland, again, everybody knows about the education system in Finland, and now it's one of the most effective in the world. So it's interesting to look at what the policies are on inclusive education and special education. In New Zealand, since about 2010, well, actually, you know, it goes back before that, 1996, the end of the 90s, they decided to try and make every school an inclusive school. And that was the policy, and it was reinforced in 2010. And it was followed by the closure of many special education facilities. The special classes that I taught in the secondary school, which I talk about in the article, which I just referred to above, I taught for 3 years a special class with children with mild intellectual disability. And the vast majority of them left into jobs. We had a vocational curriculum. We had work experience. They left into jobs. They had independence. They had lives. All those classes have been shut down. And those children are now in mainstream school classes. I should imagine not getting the vocational training or the work experience that they did in the 1970s when I was there. And at the same time as New Zealand putting in place this inclusive philosophy, which has been successful in that less than 1% of the total school population is educated in special schools and special classes now, less than 1%. They still have them. If you look, they still have, I think, about 6 or 7 special schools and other special facilities, because they can't get rid of them, because the parents would just go, you know, would be too forceful, you know, so they can't get rid of them totally. But they got rid of a lot of special education facilities. And at the same time as implementing this inclusive education philosophy, funnily enough, overall educational outcomes has declined. If you look at the PISA results for New Zealand, starting back about the year 2000, and follow it through, every time there's a PISA assessment, the New Zealand standards go down. And to my mind, it's partly because they've taken away effective education for a good proportion of, say, 10, 15% of children. at the lower end of achievement who would achieve more had they had more input from the special classes or special schools. In Barbados, we have a huge problem. We have a huge challenge to overcome, which the government is trying to, through education reform, is trying to change. But currently, and since the 1950s, we use a high stakes examination at age 11 for entry into secondary school, to transition children to secondary school. So there's 23 secondary schools, and they sit this 2-hour exams coming up soon. It's on the 7th of May for this year's poor things that are sitting it. A 2-hour exam on maths and English determines your education future for the rest of your life, because those with the top scores go to the top, the most highly respected secondary schools, and those with lower scores go to the lower secondary schools. So it's ability grouping via schools. The schools all have different ability levels, and no prize for guessing which of the 23 schools, which 8 of the 23 schools provide nearly all the inmates for the prison. You'd never guess it's the bottom of the bottom 8 of the 23 schools. So we have a major problem. And it's not just that, it's the behavior, it's the underachievement, which is produced. I'm mentioning this because I think something similar is being proposed for Greek education, that you bring in more of these high stakes tests and dividing children up. And I would absolutely beg you to fight all you can to oppose that, because here it's terrible. You know, children at the age of 11 sit a 2-hour exam and they're defined as failures for the rest of their school life. So naturally, when they go through the school system, and when they come out the other end, it's estimated that 70% of secondary school leavers in Barbados leave with no qualifications whatsoever. I mean, it's just incredible, isn't it? So the majority are leaving school without qualifications because they've been told at age 11 that they're failures. And of course, what happens then in primary schools is all the attention has been on trying to get kids to pass or do well in this exam at age 11. So the primary school curriculum has been so limited that actually we have a huge rate of failure of children learning to read and write and do basic maths in the primary school. And this is all because having these high stakes exam to divide children up. All children should have an excellent education, with the special needs being focused on for those that are struggling. And of course, this is what happens in Finland, which is why Finland is so good. Finland incorporates high quality provision for special education in their general education system. So I think it's something like 8% of children in Finland go through the school system in some kind of special needs facility, or it used to be. They're even trying to reduce that. But in the first couple of years of school in Finland, over 30% of children are identified of having special needs, and help is provided for them to overcome that. So that's why Finland has one of the lowest gaps between high achievers and low achievers in the world. And it's why New Zealand has one of the highest, the biggest gaps between the high achievers and the low achievers in the world, because there's not the special education infrastructure in New Zealand as there is in Finland. So all very relevant. And this material here is covered in our latest book, the 2023 book on inclusion with Philippa Gordon-Gould. We go into all this. And so I just really hope that Greek authorities can take note. And so the conclusion is education systems are most effective when they combine the education, special education, with inclusive education. And the inclusive education, the Crossroad books covers that. However, the case of Ireland, now I had two visitors from Ireland, just went back to Ireland after spending 2 weeks with me. recently, and it was fantastic. There are two top academics, one in the field of special education, one in the field of literacy education. And so I was very pleased to get updated about what's happening in Ireland. I don't know whether you know much about Ireland, but Ireland for many years has had a very well-established system of special schools and special classes as part of mainstream schools. And the special classes cater for children with ASD, autistic spectrum disorder, and children with intellectual disabilities. But they have a very well-established system. But in November 2019, the Irish National Council for Special Education and the Ministry of Education together published proposals to move to a full inclusion model following consultation with representatives from New Brunswick and Portugal about the effects of their full inclusion. And they were all set to move to this full inclusion model. However, there was a very strong reaction to the full inclusion proposal from parents and teachers. And now recently, in January 2024, they've done a total U-turn. The final policy advice, which represents a significant U-turn, and the press release states, well, I can't see part of this, but I hope the policy recommends phased development of a realization inclusive education system for Ireland. It envisages the system will be informed by and aligned to relevant articles of the UNCRPD, which Ireland ratified in 2018. The advice recommends a phased transition with incremental changes taking place over many years, with special schools remaining an important placement option for students and parents. And my colleagues tell me that, in other words, the current approach, the current planned approach for the future of special education is consistent with inclusive special education and now rejects full inclusion. So Ireland have looked at full inclusion, they investigated it, very enthusiastic about it, and they rejected it. And I'm hoping that Greece will do the same. We'll look very carefully at the evidence for the changes that they're proposing and think very carefully before changing what you have, I understand, is a pretty impressive special needs setup that's pretty effective, and to throw that away for full inclusion when there's no evidence that full inclusion is feasible and certainly not more effective than some sort of combination of special education and inclusive education. So the way forward then is that after many years of unsuccessful attempts to implement the idealistic vision of full inclusion in education systems, different parts of the world, the full inclusion movement may have come to a final crossroads. We do hope so. This has come about mainly through realization of the impossibility of effectively educating the numbers, the diversity, the complexity of children with special needs who would all be in mainstream classrooms in a true full inclusion system. So for the United Nations agency to continue to promote this failed approach will inevitably diminish effective education provision for young people and overall education outcomes. This has now been realized by some countries like Ireland, which now consider the way forward is through integrating aspects of inclusive education and special education by using an inclusive special education approach. So hopefully other countries, including Greece, will come to the same conclusion. These are the references here that I've been talking about that will be made available to you. And then I want to go on, if you're still with me, to the second half of the talk, which is looking at evidence-based teaching practices and also co-teaching, because co-teaching has been widely recommended as a way of almost replacing special education. Well, let's have a look at that as well. I mean, co-teaching is being promoted by the United Nations and also by the European, what is the name of it? European Agency for Special Needs in Education, are promoting a co-teaching approach. And yeah, well, co-teaching, let's have a look at it, and let's have a look at evidence-based practice, because that's what we want. We want practice based on evidence of what works, what makes a difference. So this is the Inclusive Special Education book that I did in 2014. And in writing it, and researching it, I identified there were 8 key evidence-based practices for teaching children with special needs and disabilities. And came to realize afterwards that these evidence-based practices are relevant to all children in all schools. And so we can improve instruction across the whole education system by focusing on these 8 evidence-based practices. So a couple of years ago, along with Debbie Greaves, as I say, is a special needs teacher and trainer in Atlanta, Georgia, we came up with this book. And the idea of it is it's taking these 8 evidence-based strategies and providing links, YouTube links to videos that demonstrate how each strategy is used at various levels from primary school through to secondary school. And there's examples of videos from places all over the world, from Australia, India, you name it. And my rationale is, if teachers can see other teachers using these techniques on YouTube and watch it or watch it again, they're more likely to be able to implement these evidence-based practices. So what are the evidence-based practices that came out of my research for the 2014 book? Well, these are they: metacognitive strategies, peer tutoring, direct instruction, parental involvement, teacher-student rapport, functional behavior analysis, formative evaluation, and cooperative learning. So these are the 8 strategies. So let's have a look at those a little bit in detail, and then let's have a look at co-teaching and how they can involve some of these strategies. But first of all, evidence-based practice, what exactly is it? It's practices and programs shown to have high quality research to have meaningful effects on student outcomes. In other words, not just one study. So it's more precise than saying being research-led or research-informed or research-based. You need to have a body of research that is high-quality research with good methodology that shows that this practice is effective, but also the effective part is shown by having a meaningful effect. In other words, not just providing a 5% increase in reading skills. You're looking at 50% increase or a 60% increase. You're looking at a major impact in order to be evidence-based practice. So it requires a body of quality research plus evidence of substantial impact on students' lives. So research evidence for effectiveness of education interventions now found in a range of sources: database searches on Google, various reviews, meta-analyses, synthesis of research literature, ERIC, EBSCO, Web of Science, plus the Teaching and Learning Toolkit is a source in England of evidence-based practice, as is the Best Evidence Encyclopedia. These are all free resources. It's what Bob Slavin set up. And also the What Works Clearinghouse in the US, again, a free resource that looks at evidence-based practice. And what many people know is now John Hattie, who is a New Zealand academic, who for many years, for 20 years, he gathered together all the studies and meta-analyses on every type of intervention in the field of education. And he put these together in a book in 2009. And there've been several other books come after it, and he's got a recent one out. But it's all basically looking at the research evidence for what is an evidence-based practice in education, so that teachers can use the most effective procedures, the most effective strategies. So I relied on John Hattie's work quite a bit. And he provided me with a foreword for the for the 2022 book. So he approves of what I'm suggesting in that with the 8 key evidence-based strategies. So this is all based on effect sizes, and effect size, as you probably know, is worked as a measure of the difference between the size of change on some variables between an experimental group and a control group following an intervention. It's widely used as a measure of impact, size of the impact. And Cohen has standard text on this. Effect sizes of around 0.2 are small, 0.5 are moderate, and 0.8 are large. And what Hattie found out was that the average effect size for education interventions is 0.4. So it suggests that if your intervention has an effect size of less than 0.4, it really is something you shouldn't be doing a lot of. You should be looking for interventions with effect sizes of above 0.4, and certainly you need an effect size of at least 0.4 for something to be considered an evidence-based practice. So these are some sample effect sizes from Hattie. Providing feedback to students, 0.73, evidence-based practice. Teacher-student relations, very high, 0.72. Teaching study skills, metacognitive skills, 0.59. Cooperative learning, 0.59. Reading recovery, which is a specific reading program for learners having difficulty with reading, was developed by Mary Clay in New Zealand. Mary Clay was one of my tutors when I trained as an educational psychologist in New Zealand. And reading recovery is very well researched, and there's stacks of research evidence around the world of its effectiveness in providing substantial impact on students' reading. So now, doing homework at secondary schools, that is below 0.4, 0.29. So although it has some effectiveness, 0.29, it really isn't worth the effort that's put into it, according to John Hattie, and I agree. Ability grouping, this is a major one, because ability grouping is widely used around the world, but look at the effect size, 0.12. It does not produce overall better academic outcomes. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then, of course, retention in grade, still used in the USA, where children, I think, it was used in Barbados, but less so now. It actually, children do worse overall. You get the odd child that does do better when they're kept made to repeat a year at school. Yeah, but most children do worse. So Hattie's given us this window into things that work and things that don't work. But when I look for a consensus across all the different sources of evidence-based practice, I found there were these 8 evidence-based practices that were found to have a substantial impact on learning and outcomes, and that could be implemented by teachers at every type of school: primary school, secondary school, special school, preschool schools, so that the ones that teachers can use. So the 8 evidence-based practices are key to improving outcomes, and the idea would be to embed them into teachers' everyday practice, including the practice of co-teaching. We'll talk about it in a minute. However, many practices prevalent in schools are not evidence-based practices. It's important that teachers can tell the difference and avoid non-evidence-based practice. For example, ability grouping is not an evidence-based practice, but it's widely used in schools worldwide. Between class setting is widely used in English secondary schools, so that children are they have one home class that they're in, but then they go off to a different set for maths or English or whatever. And that is a form of ability grouping. It's the mildest form of it, but it's still not effective. But then the between class grouping that's used in New Zealand high schools, which both of my sons, it affected their education badly for various reasons. But what happens is that you go into secondary schools, everybody goes to the local secondary school, but then they give you an exam or test, and they put you in A, B, and C, or whatever they call it, or different classes depending on the results of these tests. And so it's between class ability grouping. And that's, that, as I say, is not effective and more drastic than setting. And then the worst of all is the school ability grouping that we have in Barbados, where you give them an exam at age 11, and then you put them in totally different schools based on their so-called ability level. And the damage that does to children's education is just huge. So ability grouping is not an evidence-based practice. And I conducted 3 studies in New Zealand schools on ability grouping. And it's obvious that staff are well aware that it's not effective, it doesn't work, and it has negative consequences, but they still use it anyway. And if you read this article, ability grouping in New Zealand high schools, are practices evidence-based? Well, no, they're not, but they're still widely used. Why? It just doesn't make sense to me. Another one, learning styles, very popular in schools in England and New Zealand. The idea of all children have different learning styles and we should pay attention to their different learning styles. Unfortunately, this is not an evidence-based practice. So the rationale is that learners differ in preferring visual, auditory, tactual, kinesthetic learning styles. So teaching should be matched to these to be more effective. Unfortunately, there's no accepted model of learning styles. There's 71 different schemes, 13 major models, some overlapping concepts, but limited comparative models, so nobody can really agree what it is. There's a plethora of commercial checklists for measuring learning styles, but a lack of reliability of these checklists. So there's a lack of evidence for the construct of learning styles. So the validity and correctness of it, validity and reliability of it is very limited. So there's little empirical support for matching instruction to learning styles. And also labeling the learning styles of students may mean some students may not be given experiences because they're thought to be a visual learner and not an auditory learner, whereas all students are visual learners and auditory learners and tactile learners. So it's the conclusion from the literature from the Pashler review is the contrast between the popularity of learning styles and the lack of credible evidence for its utility is striking and disturbing. So there's 2 things that are used widely in schools throughout the world, but they're not evidence-based practices, where these things, as I mentioned before, these all have evidence-based, as I'll briefly try and show now, because I have been talking for about 50 minutes. So I'll just give a brief overview and then I'll talk about co-teaching. So the 8, metacognitive, formative evaluation, peer tutoring, cooperative learning, teacher-student rapport, parental involvement, direct instruction, functional behavior analysis. So first of all, metacognitive. See, Hattie has effect size of, it's gone off my page, 0.6 something or other. So it's clearly an evidence-based practice, clearly a really positive thing. 3 types of metacognitive strategies: study skills. Teaching study skills is so important, but not really done much in schools. They've been shown to really make a big difference to children's outcomes. Reciprocal teaching is a means of promoting children's comprehension, reading comprehension. And again, that has a very high effect size. And concept mapping is something which is widely used. I know Dimitris has just done a major paper on concept mapping. It's a strategy that builds on prior knowledge and is used in all curriculum areas to demonstrate the relationship between ideas and can be used at all different levels of education. For example, we can all do it. Start the lessons, each lesson with a concept map, which provides an overview of the learning that you want to take place. That sets the scene then for the students. Formative evaluation, Hattie, as you probably know, sees that as one of the most powerful interventions, and his effect size he had in the 2009 book is 0.73. So this is where you provide frequent feedback so students can make changes or teachers can adjust their strategies in order to optimize learning. So the purpose is to motivate learners by informing them how well they've done and showing them how to improve. So feedback should be timely, explicit, and constructive. Formative assessment and feedback provide direction to teachers and students or as individuals, or can be used in small groups. So by assessing where students are initially and providing ongoing feedback, examining the gaps in students' knowledge, teachers can plan the most appropriate activities to facilitate learning. So an example is to give assignment feedback, not at the end when they finish the assignment, but during when they're doing assignments, so that students can build in the feedback that they get from teachers into the assignment to provide produce a better final outcome. So changing our view of assessment from assessing the final product to doing assessment during the process of doing it to help them improve their learning and improve their final outcome. Peer tutoring, 0.55. This can be used with individuals, small groups, class-wide. A whole range of tutors can be used, many types of peer tutors, used in all curriculum areas. And the thing is, lots of evidence that shows that both the tutors and the tutees gain academically and socially. And as teachers, we know this because we know that if you want to understand something better, teach it to someone else. So using peer tutoring is a very powerful strategy that should be used in all classrooms. It improves the social climate of the classroom because kids helping one another, it becomes the norm. So we should encourage study in pairs and small group work in order to get more peer tutoring. Cooperative learning, I came across this through Bob Slavin's work. Instructional use of small groups in which students work together to maximize their own and each other's learning. It must follow, to be cooperative learning, it has to have individual accountability and positive interdependence. All small groups learning experience are not cooperative learning unless they have individual accountability and positive interdependence. That's what really drives the positive outcomes. Individual accountability is when performance of each student is assessed and results are given back to the individual, but also to the group. And positive interdependence occurs when students can only reach their goals if others in their group also reach theirs. In other words, built in, working together in the cooperative learning group has to be built in, so the helping one another becomes a part of it, and the peer tutoring is a part of that. So lots of cooperative learning approaches, such a simple one like timed pair share is very powerful. Numbered heads together is extremely useful. And then more elaborate ones like Jigsaw Classroom that Bob Slavin came up are also really well, and also Aronson and everything. So they take a little bit of more effort setting up, but they really do produce better results in terms of kids' attention and their behavior and their outcomes. Functional behavior analysis. So again, all teachers have to know the basics of this. We're observing and collecting data, planning interventions, and so all the things that we know about identifying the antecedents, looking at possible consequences, developing hypotheses, and then collecting data to test what works and what doesn't. I mean, there's some very simple approaches that I use as a psychologist to really help teachers. You've probably seen these things, and it really does make a difference. It's not the most exciting of approaches, but it definitely works. Using descriptive praise and group contingencies to reinforce appropriate behavior. An example of using functional behavior analysis. So not just saying, oh, well done, saying, oh, well, I really like about your project is such and such. Or what I really like the way you have improved your behavior by putting your hand up to ask questions rather than shouting out. So all these things are really not, they're not new but they are definitely effective. Direct instruction. This is prescriptive teacher-directed approaches, specifying the knowledge and skills to be learned, establishing the criteria, building student engagement in order to focus attention, providing information and helping kids work through examples to check understanding, teachers providing individual feedback and remediation as necessary, and then reviewing and clarifying key points. And then practicing on different examples to facilitate generalization. A systematic reading program such as Reading Recovery is one example of direct instruction and a very effective one. Parental involvement at both school and at home has been found to be an effective strategy for improving educational achievement. And as teachers, I know we weren't really taught how to work with parents. We just expected that we'd learn. But I came to find as a teacher and both as a psychologist that working as close as you can with parents is your best way to improve both the behavior of the children and their achievement. And so it really is worthwhile looking to on the potential contributions being utilized. And this is in the Inclusive Special Education book as well, parental involvement. And focusing on effective parent-teacher meetings, home visits, using email, newsletters, notes on homeschool diaries, progress reports, telephone use, text messages, all sorts of aspects that can be used to promote learning. And one thing, visiting all parents at home before children are about to begin school. That's just one example. Being prepared to make a home visit. I was encouraged to do that when I started as a special class teacher. And as a secondary school teacher, we never visited parents at home. But when I was teaching a special class, I had 15 boys. And I was told, you must visit their parents at home in the school holidays before you start teaching them. Wow, what a difference that made. The parents and I were then working together on these kids to make sure that their education was effective. Best thing I ever did, biggest learning I ever made, working with closely with parents. One of my PhD students here is head teacher of an ordinary primary school, 300 children. She gives all the parents her cell phone number. Every parent of a child in the school has her cell phone number. Can you imagine? I mean, but she wants them to feel they can contact her anytime that they're concerned, that they're worried. This has been a failing school and she's turning it around. And a lot of that is through effective parental involvement. One of the most important things at all, as we all know, is your teacher-student rapport, your relationships that teachers establish with individual students and groups of students, a critical element of effectiveness of your teaching. And I've always based what I've done on Carl Rogers' work, genuineness, respect, and empathy. Being genuine, coming across as real people with your own feelings and concerns, respecting students' views and parents' views, not being judgmental, and being empathic in understanding and taking account of students' and parents' perspectives and behavior. And in order to develop such relationships, teachers need to have good interpersonal skills, listening skills, such as paraphrasing and active listening, interpersonal skills, such as giving constructive feedback and using conflict resolution. Also, teachers need to have group skills, such as reflecting and clarifying, moderating and consensus taking, probing and confronting. These are all described in my parent involvement books, but also in the Inclusive Special Education book. And then if teachers have all those, they have the skills to effectively lead things such as circle time. I don't know how widely that's used in Greece. Came from England. It's used widely in New Zealand. It's used in Barbados to a certain extent, but also other developmental group work approaches, which make a huge difference to building a positive caring and respectful ethos in the classroom. And a simple thing, asking for feedback from students at the end of each lesson. What was one thing that you really enjoyed about that lesson? What was one thing that you found difficult about that lesson? You know, make that a set. At the end of each lesson, leave 5 minutes to get some feedback from the students. It's a very powerful technique. Now, on to co-teaching then. Well, Hattie, 2009, his effect size for co-teaching is 0.21. And remember that effect sizes below 0.4 are seen as being ineffective, not evidence-based practices. So co-teaching has been widely recommended for teaching children with special needs, despite not being an evidence-based practice. And this is the European Association for Special Needs in Education. And that's a brief video. I haven't time to do it now, but you can look at the video. They're promoting co-teaching as a way to deal with all children with special needs. Well, yes, it should be available to be used, but it's not the magic bullet. It's, you know, and you need to do it as effectively as possible. And the research evidence so far is that that's not the case. But it's important to involve then as many of the 8 key evidence-based practices we've just been looking at when using co-teaching. Use peer tutoring, use cooperative learning, use formative assessment, use all these things within co-teaching to make it more effective. There's 6 models of co-teaching, but most studies show that teachers generally just only use one, so they don't look at other forms of co-teaching. And the implementation of co-teaching we looked at in a recent article, which I collaborated with some Polish colleagues. Implementation of co-teaching in the USA, Australia, Finland, Ireland, Greece, and Germany, all quite different in the way it's being used. And we looked at that and we tried to pull out what are the most effective practices. The 5 key recommendations for the best practice and implementation of co-teaching are to embed peer coaching in evidence-based practices within each co-teaching partnership. So in other words, see it as a way of teachers helping one another, learning from one another, and coaching one another. Establishing consistent routines and protocols for planning and reviews. And the main thing is insisting on the school authorities that you must have time to plan, to work, if you're going to work together in a co-teaching situation. Planning time needs to be built in, and debriefing time needs to be built in. Otherwise, it's not going to be as effective as it could be. Provide ongoing teacher professional development and structured peer coaching. So there must be continued teacher training to show using the different types of co-teaching to see how you can use evidence-based practice within those types. Encouraging teachers to avoid over-reliance on only one model of co-teaching, and ensuring that interventions are aligned with the needs of children with special educational needs who are supported. So that's the things we came up with in the article. So hopefully that might be useful. And if anybody wants a copy of that before it's published, please do email my email address. So these are the references then for that second half of the talk. Congratulations if you're still awake or still functioning. I hope it's been useful, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you'd like to come up with. That's my email address if you want to email me for any of the articles or things that I've recommended, or ask me a question. I'm more than happy to ask. So now I'd hand it back over to Dimitris and say that I'm happy to answer any questions.
Garry, thank you for your wonderful and valuable presentation on the hot issues and controversies surrounding inclusive special education and the new landscape formed in special education with the advent of evidence-based practices. We have 7 questions from 6 teachers, and additional questions may arise as you respond to the initial questions. I will proceed now with the questions translated into English. The first question, how how can we include children with special educational needs in kindergarten when the situation in Greece is that there is quite often, there is, not always, but quite often, there is only one kindergarten teacher for up to 25 children. And when our schools do not have always resource rooms.
That's a great question, and one that is relevant here in Barbados. The ministry is just having a meeting here next week, because they're finding a lot of children at the preschool level or early school entry level are too difficult to deal with by the one teacher in the preschool or the one teacher in the early primary school. You say it's a resource issue. Harking back, as you tend to do when you're 75. But when I was an educational psychologist in New Zealand, we had a perfect solution for this. We had, I was a psychologist in the southern part of Auckland, which is a poor area. And we had one particular kindergarten in that area and one in the area next door to it, which had what's called a special group of special needs children in the normal kindergarten class. This group had 6 children with special needs and a teacher, a special needs teacher, to work with that 6 children to help them integrate into the kindergarten, to help the other kindergarten teachers work with them, and to work with the other children. And, you know, the 2 teachers worked together, and the special needs teachers obviously focused on the 6 special needs kids who had a range of special needs. They were typically intellectually disabled, in some level of intellectual disability or autism, to help them fit in. So that perfect situation of having a kindergarten with a second teacher to look after 6 children who had special needs was brilliant. So what happened to that? Well, when the New Zealand Ministry of Education decided to focus on inclusive schools, all those kindergarten special groups were shut down in the name of inclusion. Isn't that disgusting? Because it was a perfect example of inclusion, including the children in the kindergartens, in the special groups, integrating, working alongside the other children with the 2 teachers working together was a really good example of inclusion. But that, to me, is what a lot of this is about. The same happens in Barbados as is happening in Greece. If we had the additional teacher, you know, who was trained to cater with special needs kids, it would not be an issue. It would be a fantastic thing to do a setup just like I mentioned, but we don't. And it just means it makes life difficult for the teacher that's there by themselves with the 25 kids. You get one of those 25 as, you know, severe behavior problems or severe learning problems. And a lot of time has got to be spent dealing with that kid. Whereas, you know, if you have an additional person, it makes a huge difference. Can I just say as well, 2 Irish colleagues that came over, one of them, as I say, was a special needs expert, and they went into the ordinary primary school in a poor area of Barbados. And this ordinary primary school has a 2-unit special class attached to the mainstream of 300 children. And so she went in to talk with the special class teacher and to see the children. And in that class was 10 children. And she estimated those children had moderate to severe learning problems. There was 1 teacher to 10 children, 10 special needs children. No teacher aide, no second teacher, or even a teacher aide, or even a parent helper. Nobody. And she said back in Ireland, the maximum number for that kind of class would be 1 to 6. 1 teacher to 6 children with included with a professional teacher aide to help. So a lot of this is cost cutting. you know, is trying to do it on the cheap, and it's putting tremendous pressure. You know, my colleague Joanna, the Irish lady, she said that the teacher of that class was wonderful, you know, providing a lot of resources herself out of her own pocket, working night and day to cater for these 10 kids. But how long is she going to be able to do that before she burns out? So I think a lot of it is about resources and pushing to properly resource education. So I hope that's helpful. We just have to realize that often what we're being asked to do is not reasonable, and we need to push for that. But a lot of people, of course, they get fed up and they drop out. You know, they go and get a job elsewhere. At the moment, a lot of Barbadian teachers are leaving Barbados and going to work in the USA. In Fairfax County in the USA, in Virginia, teachers are paid twice as much as they are in Barbados, and they work. You know, they have a lot more resources. They have a lot smaller class sizes. So we're losing some of our best teachers, and presumably in Greece, similar things will happen. People, you can't deal with a situation like that where you don't have enough people on the ground to cater for children with, you know, moderate to severe special needs. So that's my thoughts there. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Gary. There is another question. Relevant question. Do you consider that educational activities in which students with and without special educational needs are asked to collaborate with each other can contribute to the success of inclusion? And if so, why?
Yeah,
it's about the collaboration. Okay.
Yeah. I think it's possible and it's useful. And often parents might, first of all, parents of children that are non-disabled might object to it. But it's a bit like peer tutoring. You know, the children doing the tutoring quite often gain more than the children being tutored. And two situations I can think about this from my experience in New Zealand. My wife worked in a special school for children with physical and multiple disabilities that was attached to part of an ordinary mainstream primary school. And the playgrounds joined. You know, they had their own little playground with their own equipment, but they also had that went on to the other playground. So the other children in the school would come and play with the special needs kids. Any that were interested would be invited and would come in to help with, to read to the children with special needs. And so involving the children without special needs with the kids with special needs was helpful to the kids in the special needs unit. But interestingly enough, often the children who offered to help in the special needs unit were ones who were having difficulties themselves in the mainstream schools. So, you know, being able to help other children who you can see who are a lot worse off than you are can be very beneficial to children who don't have special needs. So I would encourage that as much as possible. The other situation was the high school where my two boys went to high school, had a special unit with children with intellectual disabilities who were between ages 14 and 16. And the school were very proud of that unit, actually. And whenever you visited, they showed you around the unit. And the same thing, they actually gave credit to some of the children in some of the years, I forget what years it was now, in years 4 and 5, got credit for actually going into the special needs unit and helping out with the reading and maths and things like this. So that collaboration was a part of it. And it created a good atmosphere in the special needs unit. It made them feel part of the school, but it also made the rest of the school feel like they had a responsibility to help these children who were less well off than they were. So I would very much encourage that and to explain to parents that the more your child is helping another child with lesser abilities, the better they are, because you learn a lot by teaching others, and you learn a lot about yourself. And so I would encourage it. That's my thought. I hope you agree with that.
We have 5 more questions. One of those is that can parallel support is the name for the Greek co-teaching model. Can parallel support contribute to the implementation and success of inclusion?
Well,
This is the question.
I would say yes. I think all types of co-teaching should be considered, and but important to use. Sorry, Dimitris, have I missed something? No,
No, I have finished the
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, great. Yeah. So yeah, there's it should be able to, but you have to realize that John Hattie's finding that co-teaching just by itself is not going to improve education outcomes. It's how it's done, and it's how many evidence-based practices you can build into the co-teaching. It's parallel teaching, how much those two teachers can support one another, in the time in the class, how much time they get to plan beforehand and debrief afterwards. So it's, just by, I think some of these bodies like the European Agency, you think just by kill this phone, just by suggesting co-teaching, you're going to improve inclusion. No, it's not. It's the way it's done and the resources that are provided to it. You have to provide the time for the teachers to plan beforehand and to debrief afterwards. You have to provide teacher education, training for those teachers, maybe training in evidence-based practices that they can implement during the parallel teaching. So it can, yes, but like everything else, if it's just parallel teaching and it's not done properly, if it's not done the most effectively, it probably isn't going to make any difference. And it's probably going to be a waste of resources. That's my opinion.
If I may add a few details to your answer, we conducted the study with Trifon Mavropalias in Greece back in 2016, and we realized that the Greek co-teaching model is a static model, like one form of what the literature says about one teach, and the teacher who teaches is the general education teacher, and the teacher who assists is the special education teacher. And in this form does not work so well in the Greek schools. And we had another study last, I think she came out last year, and we found that the collaboration in this form of co-teaching model between the general education teacher and the special education teacher was really low, a very low collaboration. These are some details that I would like to ask, but of course, it has to do how we implement some good ideas and some good models. But I wouldn't say that the Greek co-teaching model is one of the best we can see around the world.
Yeah, it seems that
anyway,
with a little bit of research that we did, it seems that each country has different forms of co-teaching, and they seem to get stuck on one particular form and don't consider other forms. But the other thing is just the resources, the training and the planning time and all that are really the limiting factors. So yeah, thanks, Dimitris.
And some people in the Ministry of Education may think that they can overcome the cultural factor and the culture that does exist at this moment in schools, and implement an institution that requires a very high collaboration between the two teachers. But this is not the reality at the present. Anyway, there is another question about the universal design for learning. The question is formulated like this. I will make a clarification here, but I will first read the question. Should the universal design for learning be implemented in schools and outside schools in society for inclusive education to succeed? This is the question. Of course, universal design for learning is for schools. It emerged from universal design in architecture, but when we refer to universal design for learning, we refer to universal design in schools and the curriculum. Garry.
Yeah, I think generally it's a useful concept and we should try and use it as much as possible. As you say, it's come from the architectural idea that when you build a building, you design it so everybody can access it. And yet, true with buildings around Barbados and I'm sure around parts of Greece, you know, this building that I'm in now, I now have a disability and I can't walk very far, but there's no means of getting down to the beach unless you go down these 12 steps. At least there's a handle and you can do that, but other places where they don't have a disability parking spot, you don't have a ramp to get into buildings, you know, so how do you deal with a wheelchair? It's, you know, so when we have to apply that thinking to education, how can we involve as wide a range of children as possible in the teaching the assignments that we set, and so that children can respond in different ways and children can be evaluated in different ways. It's just a mindset, I think, which is useful to be alongside the other things you should need to focus on, which is using other evidence-based practices. So it's not, you know, it's not always possible to provide learning outcomes for for the wide range of individuals that you get in the class, and because it doesn't deal with the issue that these days we're getting more and more children. Well, it seems to be in most countries I'm dealing with. There's certainly in terms of children with ASD, you know, autism syndrome disorder seem to be increasing in Barbados, and where you have one child in a class that you need to design a different way of responding for, that's maybe possible. But where you have 3, 4, or 5 children, all with different kinds of special needs, makes the teachers' work very, very difficult to think of, you know, addressing all those. So, yeah, universal design for learning is definitely a good thing. But, you know, again, the practical realities of implementing it have to be considered.
We currently have 2 review papers, which are other reviews submitted to special educational journals. And what I could say is that universal design for learning maybe sometimes is a good idea, is a general instructional framework, but the devil is always in the details. And the other thing is that universal design for learning is not a substitute for individualized instruction, special design instruction, what we actually do in special education. The next question has to do with Portugal. You know, yesterday, no, 2 days ago, I think there was an event organized by UNESCO Greece in collaboration with the Greek Ministry of Education. And perhaps the question has to do with this online event. The question is the following. Are you aware of the situation that has developed in Portugal after the passing of the law? The law, I think, the law on special education is not on special education. The law was on inclusive education. And it passed, I think, in October 2018, where special schools, special education schools have been abandoned. To clarify that special education schools, the law wants to eliminate special education schools, but at the moment there is a very fluid situation. Special education schools do exist, and there are many reactions to this law coming from parents and special education schools and special education teachers. Garry, would you like to say something about it, if you know?
Yeah. Our colleague João in Portugal has commented on this, hasn't he, Dimitris, that the actual situation on the ground is a bit different to what is being presented in some of these meetings, and that's the case as well in Italy, you know, which you've written about as well, Dimitris, that we were told that, oh, well, all the special schools in Italy were shut down in 1977. And then when you look at it, you find, no, that's not the case. There's still scores of special schools and special units, and the back door means of providing special education. So claims are often made about what is being done or what can be done. I mean, New Brunswick could be another example of it. That when you look carefully at it, you say, no, this is not really the case. And there's a big divide between government policies and what they'd like to work, which of course is the cheapest way possible, what they'd like to work and they like to promote, is often quite different from the reality. And I think we have to keep pointing that out. I mean, as I presented the case of Ireland, which was just about on the brink of adopting a full inclusion model and closing down as many of the special schools and special classes as possible, when the huge reaction from parents and teachers, teacher unions presumably too, managed to turn it around, you know, by providing evidence that this is not going to make things better for children with special needs or for other children as well. So I think we need to look very carefully what the situation is in Portugal on the ground. And I'd certainly talk to our colleague there. João was very, very much in touch with what's happening, and he's written about it. But yeah, we have to be the term that's being used in the last few years is fake news, isn't it? Fake news. And things are being said that quite often are not true. That's why Jim Kaufman and I wrote the Zombies article. A lot of people are promoting full inclusion on the basis of what's being said, which is not true. And yet they're still being promoted. It's acting like a zombie. The ideas should die off because they're not realistic. But if lies are told often enough, well, that's being a bit strong perhaps, but if things are presented a certain way often enough, or people believe them, well, yeah, before you let go of a working system that works in special education and get rid of it, then ideally you should provide evidence of what works better. And that's what's not been done in New Zealand. As I say, I just talk about those lovely special units in those kindergartens, which worked extremely well, but they were just shut down with no evidence, no rationale, no nothing apart from cost. You know, so I think that's it. We need to look very carefully at Portugal before decisions are made.
There are two more general questions. The first has a rationale. I will try to translate precisely the rationale. Teachers in Greece, after the financial crisis of 2010, are experiencing a peculiar regime of performativity, as Stephen Ball, a well-known sociologist, would say. This is the introduction. The same applies to special education teachers who sometimes teach in 2, 3, or 4 schools. There is a portion of special education, to clarify, there is a portion of special education teachers in Greece who move from school to school. This is, I think, that the spirit of the comment here. They often do not have a classroom to teach or the proper teaching tools, and there are many schools without special education teachers. The question is, has to do with the Minister of Education. If the Minister of Education in Greece were with us at this event, today's event, what proposal would you make so that special education teachers can implement your inclusive special education proposal, Garry?
Yeah, well, as you said, it's very important to get the message across to people like ministers of education. And that's where my Irish colleague, Joanna Fitzgerald, she's now on a committee with people from the ministry to, propose solutions that are evidence-based. And, that's the ultimate, that you have to try and provide such people as ministers with evidence that if they go ahead with what they're proposing, that it will make things worse. It will affect children's education badly, and their parents will complain. And the parents are voters; they vote for people. And if parents and teachers and teacher unions point out what is going to be more effective and what's going to work, and what is going to be less effective on damage education, that's all we can do, really. And then these people, as you know, they take the decisions, and the more we can get the evidence-based policy, the better. But it's not easy. I realize that.
Okay, one question. One more question came in, so we have 2 questions left. The first of these questions, general questions. I have studied your articles, and I'm concerned about your proposal for inclusive special education. I understand your proposal is a different definition for inclusive education, because in the opinion of the person who addressed the question, inclusive education preserves special education, maintains special education. But sometimes the person who asks recognizes that inclusive education is applied in a neoliberal way, in a selective, which is a kind of neoliberal selective inclusionism. Does your proposal relate? This was the rationale. The question, the 2 questions are the following. Does your proposal relate to your work in secondary education, where policymakers first and foremost circumvent, overcome reasonable accommodations? Can we talk about inclusive education in secondary education? 2 questions going together.
Yeah, yeah. Well, to me, the goals of inclusive education that are stated are consistent with the goals of special education. We really want to enable as many children as possible to develop skills in order to be able to live effective lives after school, to be able to transition into jobs in the community, and also be able to live independently. So those are things that inclusive education and special education both want. But what needs to, and of course, it's absolutely vital, because if children finish their schooling and they don't have the skills to find jobs in the community, and they don't have the skills to live independently, they're going to be on state disability benefits or whatever for the rest of their lives. And this is what I pointed out in some of the articles that one in 2021, were children who could have worked independently, lived independently, didn't, because they were subjected to mainstream education instead of the special education training, which they really would have benefited from. And that's the issue, that basically we want the same thing. We want children to live their lives happily and effectively. And doing that means it will be less expense for the nation than actually not giving them a proper education. This is shown by the research on early intervention over the years. It was early intervention programs. Bronfenbrenner's work showed that early intervention programs might not produce huge rises in cognitive abilities or even academic achievement of children. But over the years, children who've had early intervention through Head Start programs, etc., have less demands on remedial education, are less likely to get involved with the courts and criminal education, less likely to end up in prison, less likely to end up on a disability because they can't find jobs. So the amount of saving for every dollar spent on early intervention is saved $6 later on in providing for all these other services. And I mentioned the fact that our prison here in Barbados has 700 men, 22 women, and the 700 men come from mainly 8 secondary schools, and most of them can't read and write properly. So those who end up in prison, but all the others that are out of work, on disability benefits, or homeless. This is what we have to make a choice. Do we provide an education system that gives kids the skills and the confidence they need to live effective lives after school? And to my mind, we have to look very carefully when we're throwing out, or potentially throwing out, effective special education provision for something that is a philosophy, a full inclusion philosophy, which has not provided evidence that it helps kids become independent and more likely to live happy, constructive lives. So that's my response. I don't know if that's fully answered the question, but I feel very strongly about this. That we all want to live in a society where children are helped. Children with the special needs have those needs met, where parents get the support that they need to help those children. If you have a child with special needs, you've got a much harder job than other parents. So the parents deserve all the support they can get. The children deserve to have appropriate programs, and they deserve to come out of school with the skills and the confidence to live lives effectively. That's better for them, it's better for their families, and it's better for our society as well, because it's very expensive to support people who can't support themselves. So sorry, that's a real issue here in Barbados. One project I'm working on at the moment with the chair of the Autistic Society is that there is nothing for autistic young adults to do. They've been given schooling which has not prepared them for jobs or to live independently for many of them. So many of them are living with their parents, knowing that parents are going mad. They can see their children sitting about doing nothing, right? So we're setting up, we've got a building from the government, or he's got a building from the government, and I've been asked to help provide the program to actually teach life skills to young adults with autism in order to give them something to do during the day, but also hopefully to give them the skills to live more independently, and hopefully for some of them, many of them we hope, to be able to get jobs in the community. I mean, we're addressing this now when these young people are young adults, because the school system has failed them, has absolutely failed to develop the skills that they need. So that's one thing we have to be aware of. It's no good having this wonderful aim of all children being educated together in the same classrooms. If at the end of schooling, some of those kids come out and live no ordinary lives, and some of them come out and just can't live good lives. So we have to think of ways of doing this. And special education over the years has provided us with lots of programs and techniques and strategies in order to do this. So we need to use those as effectively as possible. And we have to fight off all these people that are trying to say, no, we can do away with all that. Just put the children in mainstream classrooms with other children and everything will be all right. No, it won't. So I'm sorry, we have to face some of the truths of what is suggested to us. And I know that inclusive special education is not, it's going to my mind, combine the best of both, and therefore more likely to meet the goals I've been talking about. But some children are going to fall between the cracks and that. But we have to look to identify them and help them as much as we can. And we can't afford to abandon children to rhetoric that is based on a idealistic theory of full inclusion. It's not fair to the children, their families, and it's not productive for the society that we live in.
Garry, the last question is a general question. The Greek education system introduces policies that promote competition between schools, promote competition among teachers. Currently they run a system of individual evaluation of teachers and promote competition among students. There is a national high stakes exam, like they call this Greek PISA. It's not like PISA because it's not high stakes there. In the 6th grade of primary school. This is the rationale of the question. Really, how can Greece talk about inclusion when teachers and students are treated like racehorses?
Yeah, we have exactly the same issue here with the 11 plus exam, which is given when children are aged 11 to determine which secondary school they go to. And it's a disaster, and it's been a disaster for years and years, and we find it difficult to get rid of it because some people benefit from that system. But in terms of cooperativeness or competitiveness, what does the research evidence in education tell us? What about cooperative learning versus competitive learning? You look at the research on that. Bob Slavin, Hattie has done this. Cooperative learning wins out every time. Cooperative learning is more effective than competitive learning. And schools cooperating together, teachers cooperating together, is likely to be more effective than teachers and schools competing with each other. And it's so obviously true, but it's governments, I don't know why our government, they say they're trying to get rid of the 11 plus because they can see all the damage that it does, this exam at age 11. And presumably in Greece, if you have that system now or you're looking to move more towards that, that's not going to be good. That's not going to be effective. It's not going to lead to more children getting good education. It's going to lead, as it does here, to more children being disruptive in schools, to more school violence, and it's a disaster, you know. So I mean, we have to look, you know, cooperating together, working together is more effective for everybody. And who wants to live in a society where we're all building big high fences and all this sort of keep all the people that didn't do well in the education system out because they don't have jobs and they don't have money, and you know, we don't want that. We want a society where everybody is contributing, and the school system is a way of doing that or not doing it. And I say it's a major issue here in Barbados. How do we get rid of this exam at age 11, which divides children up into different schools, where 5 of the 23 schools produce children that have got some qualifications and some skills, and the other 18 produce children that have various degrees of lacking confidence, lacking skills, and lacking the motivation, really, because they feel that they're failures. So, you know, we have to think very carefully about that. As I say, evidence in education is that cooperation works better than competition.
Thank you very much, Garry. I think it was a great pleasure to have you with us today. I hope that you enjoyed the experience as much as we did. And thank you again for your time and for sharing your knowledge and expertise of for how many years you have worked in different environments with different different people around the world. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks, Dimitris. It was a great pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity to sharing my views. And I hope many of your teachers, you know, can continue on doing their good work and working with children with special needs and helping their parents and families and helping the schools become positive places, because it is so important. Our job is just so important, and we must never forget that. We're under a lot of pressure from neoliberal policies and other policies that look to change things. And I'm happy I've been able to contribute a few ideas that might be useful. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. Go well.
Να ευχαριστήσω και εγώ και τους δυο σας. Να ευχαριστήσω τον Δημήτρη Αναστασίου.
I would like to thank you both, Dimitris Anastasiou, for his contribution and participation in this event. And I would like to thank especially Mr. Hornby, because he gave us the opportunity to listen to very interesting things. The answer to the last question was the essence of what we are experiencing these days. And if there was interest from the political leadership for the future of education, it should have been heard. The events of our association continue. On Friday, the 19th of April, we will have the presentation of cooperative education, and Sunday, on 28th of April, we will present our research on special education and infrastructure. We would like to thank you, all of you, participating in our events. We look forward to seeing you in our next events. It is a very serious answer on how educators can approach education more seriously than the state. I would like to thank you all on behalf of the association. I would like to thank Dimitris, Anastasiou and Garry Hornby. I wish you a good night and talk to you soon in one of our next events. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.